Hi, everybody. Professor Reese back with another edition of African American history. We've talked about kings, queens, warriors, we've talked about empires, and we've also talked about the continent of Africa. So, moving on down that timeline, it's time to start talking about the slave trades themselves, how they occurred out of Africa. The slave trade started in the 1400s when the Portuguese landed on the western coast of Africa. Remember, we talked a little bit about that. One of my favorite countries, Sierra Leone, that was their departure point back to Portugal and or Brazil with slaves. Started very, very small, 19 slaves, 50 slaves. And there was even an occasion where the Portuguese would make trades with the kings of the different countries. They would bring rum, textiles, different things that maybe Africa or the continent or that country did not have. So they were trading for slaves, but then it began to be an all-out war. Now remember, we talked about one of the queens, Queen Nzinga, who killed up to 10,000 Portuguese defending her country. So it wasn't just a slam dunk for anybody. But let's start talking about the transatlantic slave trade. Okay, these are some maps that reference the trades themselves. In the beginning, like I said, in the 1400s, the Portuguese were on the western coast of Africa. And this is where they came, picked up slaves, did trading of slaves, and took slaves back to Brazil and Portugal. So it wasn't an all blown out effect yet. That's where we get into the diaspora, but that's in our second lesson. Our second map here is a map when it became an all blown out slave trade. This was the routes that they took to the different countries. Okay, the Atlantic slave trade developed after contacts were established between the old world and the new world. You ask me, what is the new world? New world was what America was called. Old world being what was already established prior to the Americas. There was an Africa or Afro-Eurasia contact through the old world and the new world, the Americas. So once again, there was some trading going on, but not a whole lot, because before the 1400s or during the 1400s, a lot of the vessels or ships did not have the power to make it from the Americas over to the continent of Africa. Okay, so slavery, prevalent in all parts of the world. As I said, when you have kings or kingdoms or queens, sometimes you have people that are not part of the royal family, right? Right. So those people work for the king or the queen. They're not exactly called slaves, but we'll go ahead and use that term loosely. Okay, so from the beginning of the Atlantic slave trade, slavery was prevalent. There's evidence that enslaved people from some parts of Africa were exported to other countries in Africa, Europe, and Asia. After the colonization of the Americas, the New World, they begin to see that, wait a minute, Portuguese, they got a piece of this. Brazil has got a piece of this. This is free labor, and we could use that labor. So, the British pirateered a Portuguese ship. They had some maybe 50 slaves on it, took over the vessel, the Portuguese vessel, and brought those slaves back to Britain. Okay, during the slave trade, they had what was known as the triangular trade, aptly named so because it created a triangle. What was happening was that there was exportation of goods from Europe to Africa. Then we took slaves or Africans to the Americas. And then the third leg of it is the Caribbean islands, where we would also take goods and merchandise. So they had a triangular trade going on too. Pretty inventive. So what have we got so far? We've got the 1400s with the Portuguese starting to come over to the continent and make negotiations for slaves as well as take slaves, because we can say this much. There were more slaves that were taken and kidnapped than slaves that were traded. Now, we all know through history that in 1619, the slaves were first brought to the Americas, or to America. These are some of the pictures, or these are pictures, excuse me, of what the slave quarters look like. I don't know if you can see very closely here, but they're tight, folks. And then in some of the vessels, they would even put the slaves on shelves, as you would do, I don't know, books, pottery. So you can imagine the shelves were very small. So if you were of average height, which for an American, I guess is 5'5", 5'6", if you were of average height, you were, for the voyage, you were continuously slumped. And the voyage usually took anywhere from 30 to 35 days. So that's a long time to be in that position. Women and children were usually allowed on deck or on the top deck. So this is the ships, or pictures of the ships that were used in the Atlantic slave trade. Okay, so here's what we know for sure. The Atlantic slave trade happened first in the 1400s. We moved on down to the 1600s, into the 1700s, where other countries became involved. Those countries were Britain. Those countries, of course, was Europe. We had Asia involved. We had the Portuguese involved. We had Spain. We had the Netherlands. Everybody was involved in coming over to Africa and procuring slaves for either their plantations, their businesses. It was free labor. Going from the transatlantic slave trade to the diaspora, they're really kind of intertwined, but it's kind of a separate initiative that came a little bit later. So I'm going to do that in another segment. So I hope you've had fun learning a little bit about the transatlantic slave trade. And in parting, as we always do, we close it with an African proverb. And this proverb states, "Sticks in a bundle are unbreakable. Sticks in a bundle are unbreakable." That's all the time we have today. Thank you so much for tuning in. We'll see you next time.